right, so we have a number of participants on. We have a number of participants that have not come in yet, but by the time I finish talking and we get to kind of the core topic, which is my friend Fern Hernberg, I think that we'll have all of the attendees live. So good morning and thank you for attending. I hope you're eager as I am to learn more about recruiting and interviewing, especially in this, this challenging time. So just a quick note, this webinar is for providing ideas and resources, but not specific guidance or recommendations for you or your unique business situations. When I have speakers on, they're generally more than happy to engage with you and your company individually as part of your advising team, and whatever their individual discipline is, or provide consulting or tailor recommendations to you and your leadership team. And they will address, in most cases, it will address like specific questions, but it's in a general nature because they won't have all the information. So, okay, so let's get moving. We have about an hour. This webinar is approved for one SHRM credit and is still pending approval for one HRCI credit. I don't know why it's lagging so much. It was in a while ago, but it is what it is. The certificates will be emailed to those attendees post-event. I am recording this webinar both for those people that miss it or did get disconnected for whatever reason, or I want to review it again. And I'll have a link where you can see that. There's a couple different places I post it. One is out on my fledgling YouTube channel called Insurancing. If you look that up, while I'm not a millennial, I kind of like the name. You can find it. It's also on my LinkedIn page, which will actually take you out to there. And all or most of my past webinars are on my LinkedIn page as well. I don't have access to the chat feature for whatever reason. My instance of this Zoom platform doesn't, just that we don't have it. But we do have the Q&A feature. So if you have a question, you can type it into there and we'll address it. If we can address it as it happens, we will. Otherwise, in talking with Fern pre-start of this, we'll have time at the end and we'll be able to go run through those questions. So on to some introductions. For those of you that haven't attended one of these in the past, my name is Brian Klickener. I am with Risk Strategies. I've got over 20 years of experience in business development, sales, account management, and operations across various industries, including where I started, which was retail, kind of a respite inside of insurance, which is government contracting, but most extensively is insurance. I've been doing that for over a decade. Risk Strategies, here we have over 1,800 employees, and typically I say we have 70 plus offices, but we probably have 1,800 offices right now because we're all and we're all over the US, from Boston to Florida to Southern California and up the West Coast. I don't think we have an office in Hawaii, but I am asking to scout that in the future. So what I do generally is I work with clients to create bespoke employee benefit programs. And if you want to know more about what that means, we can certainly have a one-to-one outside of this. As far as webinars are concerned, I put on a ton of webinars. Today kicks off a 3-part series with Fern on the employee life cycle. And I'm going to share my screen real quick to show you just a couple of other things that I have going on. If you have an interest in registering for those, you'll see. I think I'm sharing the wrong thing. Let's see, sorry, I should be better at that. Let's do this and screen one. Okay, so here we have this today. I've got one on government contracting with a friend of mine from Republic Access Capital, Matt Stavish. Next month on the 11th, we'll have part 2, selection and onboarding. I'm working with a colleague out of Boston, Jean Nicholson, who has a really great, if you're in life sciences or biotech or know somebody that is, she has a really great HR Biotech Connect listserv. It's extremely active. I've been able and fortunate enough to kind of see the emails. I've got hundreds of emails, and it's really unique. These HR professionals are sharing, you know, kind of detailed information based upon their particular life sciences and biotech community. So if you have an interest in that and you're in that's a field that you're in, certainly we'd be interested in having you attend this webinar on the 19th. A friend of mine, Gina Weatherup, is going to be talking about how to and why to manage with empathy, which I think actually if you were in the pre-webinar stuff with Fern, we were kind of talking a little bit about this in September. And then I've got a couple different GovCon ones that are scheduled. One is on CMMC. If you're a GovCon, you know what that means. I know a little bit about it because I was in that space, but this is kind of fairly new. and one on OTAs coming up, which is yet to be scheduled, and then more of a product-oriented one with a third-party administrator that we work with, and that's next month. So you can get to this. There's a link that I'll provide in the post webinar information that you can take a look at, and you'll be able to register for any of those. Most of the HR-centric ones do come with SHRM credits, and I do generally put them in for HRCI credits as well. So now, Fern Hernberg, who is my friend here that you see. Fern is a human resources executive and entrepreneur with over 20 years of experience in for-profit and nonprofit sectors. She is also the heart of Eagle HR, which she founded in Vienna, Virginia in 2010. Fern's experience includes senior level positions with Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, Deloitte Services LP, and the USO. She also holds an undergraduate degree in communications from the University of Delaware, a Master's of Science in Human Resources from Loyola University, Chicago, and is a graduate of the Nova Dulles Society of Human Resources Management Peer Mentoring Program. She is a member of SHRM and is a certified facilitator in a variety of industry-leading assessments and training programs. With that, I'll pass the mic to Fern.
Great, Brian, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here for the first of 3 sessions, as Brian said, that will cover the employee life cycle. It's going to be hard to limit our discussion today just to the first part because once I know I geek out on all the HR stuff, and once I get started, I usually have a hard time stopping. But in the interest of time and focus, I'll do my best to really focus on what today's session is all about. And I'll share my slides here real quick for you, and we'll make these, as Brian said, available. But recruiting and interviewing, kind of the start of the employee life cycle, is the focus for today. So let me go ahead and tell you a little bit about what we're going to be able to cover in the next 53 minutes, leaving some time at the end for questions for you. I'm gonna do my best to lay out for you how I've come to view recruiting and interviewing over the course of my longer than I even want to consider career in human resources. And this really is a process. And we'll talk a lot about that, about how it really serves organizations best to kind of take a step back and look at their recruiting and interviewing, not just as single events that they have to do in order to get the right person in the door, but more as processes that really kind of enable the highest functioning possible of the organization. So we'll talk a little bit about the connection between effective hiring and success for the organization. Not a whole lot, because I do want to make sure that I leave you with some really tangible, tactical takeaways for things that you can do to enhance your recruiting and interviewing processes. We will talk about the different phases just to make sure, hopefully you're hitting all of them as you go through your process. We can't have a discussion these days without talking about the use of social media as a tool in recruiting and interviewing. And then we'll take a step back and just look at our own roles in the interviewing and recruiting processes, including making sure we're not applying our own personal biases to these processes, which can be hard sometimes. But sometimes all you need to do is just take that step back and check yourself before you make your decisions to make sure that you're clear of anything that's unintended. So that's kind of the framework for today. Just to talk bigger picture for a moment, I think sometimes, especially the busy business owner or leader, kind of falls into a trap of someone left, or we just got a new client, we have a need, right? So we need to fill that spot. And so we run right to post the job, just get the job up so we can get somebody in. And we all know that there's time sensitivities to hiring. Absolutely. I mean, theoretically, we wouldn't be willing to invest the kind of money we do in salaries if we didn't have a need for that role. But the whole recruiting process really benefits from a strategic approach. So think about it for a minute. So it's not really just about getting that one right person in. That's absolutely critical. But when you put yourself out there into the job market, when you post a role, when you invite candidates into your organization to interview, you're really marketing your business. because you're putting yourself out there and exposing yourself to tons of people who are not going to wind up being the one who comes to work with you. But you're leaving an impression on all of them. So everybody who sees your posting, everybody who gets phone screened by you, everybody whom you invite into your organization to meet with you will be left with an impression of your organization. And they're going to go back out into the world with that impression. And they could be future candidates, they could be future clients, they could be future business partners. So it's really important that we put our best foot forward in our recruiting and interviewing processes. We need to give thought to, because we are putting ourselves out there so much, so publicly in the recruiting process, we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of not just the position responsibilities, but also the culture of the organization. Again, for marketing purposes, but also to make sure that the person we bring in is a fit, not just from a skill set standpoint, but also from a culture and personality standpoint. We know that this will pay great dividends if we get the right person in the role. That starts with the second they walk through the door and hopefully lasts through all their contributions, their productivity, and hopefully a long tenure with your organization. So as with many things, unfortunately, there's not kind of a quick fix. We do want to be both strategic and detail oriented, which can take a little time and energy. But if we apply the right discipline to it, I think it becomes easier over time. It's like one of those muscles, if you just keep exercising it, it gets easier and easier. So that's what we're going to talk about. So to kind of reiterate what I said before, recruiting and interviewing really are not events, and they're best seen when they're part of a continuous process that has a lot of steps. Now, this can seem super overwhelming, like I'd rather just go to post, hire, onboard, right? That would just be the ideal. Make it quick, make it simple. But that's probably not going to serve your organization best. And just because there's lots of steps doesn't mean that they're really long or really labor intensive. We just need to be thoughtful about it. So let's start with the pre-process, right? So the pre-process is all about what we consider to be workforce planning and succession planning. And this is really the most strategic probably part of it all. Because this is where we're stepping back and we're trying not to be reactive and simply filling a hole because it opens, right? This is where we want to look at two specific things. The workforce planning piece is really trying to make sure that we've got the right people in the right place at the right time. So this is where we look at all sorts of internal and external factors, like what headcount do we currently have? If we have headcount, but they're only at 50% because of COVID, they've got to take care of kids who are at home, maybe that impacts our hiring needs. If we've got new clients as a result of what's going on in the business environment, or fewer, that's going to impact our need for headcount. It's not just going to impact how many people we need, but it's going to impact what types of skills we need, what roles the people are going to play, what hats they wear in the organization. And so workforce planning really requires you to just take that step back, look at the landscape internally and externally, and say, based on these factors, what is it that we really need before, again, we just kind of reflexively refill the position that just opened up. Maybe that's not the position we need going forward. Maybe this is an opportunity with somebody leaving the organization to take a step back and say, that worked at the time, but now what we really need is this other combination of skills going forward. I hope that makes sense. Again, use the Q&A if there's anything that you want to me to elaborate more on or talk about. So that's the workforce planning piece. The succession planning piece, well, you hear it a lot in larger organizations, but it's really just as critical in every type of organization I've seen. And this is kind of what your plan is to replace any employee who leaves. So it's that looking at, what are the key roles in your organization? Whether you have 5 employees or 50 or 500, you've got key roles. And you don't want to find yourself in the position of being really in trouble if one of those positions unexpectedly becomes vacant. So succession planning is all about what are we going to do when the people in those key roles leave? and you look at your internal staff and you say, okay, this person's close. They could probably slide into that role if we gave them some additional training or mentoring. And so you focus on that so that they're ready if the need arises. If you look internally and there's nobody in the organization who makes a reasonable successor for that role, you can start kind of soft recruiting, just meeting people, expanding your network so that if the person in that key role leaves, you have a pool of talent that you can call upon to try to pull them in. So those two pieces, and again, sessions on recruiting and interviewing, we know that, but hopefully you can see kind of where this workforce planning and succession planning comes in even before we start the recruitment process, because it's so important to know that we're recruiting for the right things. Otherwise, we're just starting on the wrong foot, and we won't maximize our efforts. So that's kind of the pre-process. But once we've identified what the right roles are that we need to fill, it's time to kind of post that vacancy that we're talking about. And so when you're writing your job postings, I think it's really important. And some will say that the importance of this varies by whether it's a job seekers market or a job hiring market. But I just feel like, the job posting is such a great opportunity to, again, market your organization and communicate things that are important to you as you're considering bringing in employees. So you definitely don't want it to be a dry list of bullet points of tasks and responsibilities. That's not going to really kind of jump out to someone who may be looking at 5 different job boards and see, a whole bunch of different postings. So the more you can make it a clear and interesting job title, you want to include that. You want to share about the organization and what an ideal candidate looks like for your organization. If you have identified culture statement or values that you can share to give candidates a sense of what your organization is truly like, it's wonderful to include that in the vacancy notice. Again, you're looking for more than just a match of skills and skill sets and experience, but also a match of personality and culture. You want that fit to drive retention. Of course, you have to include the essential duties of the job, what a typical day might look like, information on salary and benefits. It used to be, back in the day, there used to be a real reluctance to put information on salary, especially in the job postings. I've seen that go away a little bit, in part because with technology being the way it is, you kind of need something that's going to funnel your candidates so that the people that you're seeing and reviewing are really qualified, are really interested in the opportunity. Otherwise, you could find yourself, because it's so easy to just click a button and apply for a job, you could find yourself with hundreds, thousands of resumes. You really kind of want to make sure that the people you're taking the time to look at, want the salary you're offering. And so one way to kind of weed out people who are just randomly clicking on things that look somewhat appealing is to include that information. If you do have a deadline for application submissions, you'll want to include that, as well as contact details and next steps. And this will be a recurring theme throughout the rest of my slides, is we really want to communicate to candidates as much as possible what they can expect. And so to the extent that you can lay out what the interview process will be, even if it's just the next step or two in your vacancy notice. So something like, qualified or we'll be taking a look at resumes received till the end of July. If we'd like to set up a phone screen, we will reach out to you by mid-August or something like that, just to give the candidate an idea of what to expect. And they're not sitting there kind of waiting and wondering if their resume got lost somewhere, anything like that. So the main tip I'll leave you with on this one before we kind of move on to the next piece is, please make sure when you do your vacancy notice that it does mirror the existing internal position description that you have for the role. Because what we don't want is for someone to come in thinking their role is going to be one thing, and they walk in the door and get handed a position description that says something else. Because regardless of which is the accurate one, the job posting or the position description, there's a discrepancy there. And it's that discrepancy that can really put a bad taste in a new employee's mouth and say, what's going on here? Did I get kind of baited and switched? Or, what's the case here? So just make sure there's kind of harmony between the two. And ideally, have the person who's going out take a look at the position description or the vacancy notice, especially if they're leaving on good terms. Say, hey, would you mind, we're hiring for your replacement. Would you mind taking a look at this and make sure it's an accurate reflection of what you do every day? And get their thoughts. Or, what were the best things you loved about this job? Hear from them and then include that in the vacancy notice, as kind of a carrot for someone to apply. So once you've got your vacancy notice prepared, you're going to move on to the next step in the process, which we call sourcing. There's different types of sourcing. So what a lot of organizations do, especially because of lack of time and resources, is what we call passive sourcing. So that's basically where you post your vacancy notice and you wait for applications to come in, right? So we post on Indeed or, Career Builder, or pick your spot. And then we have a mailbox where all the resumes are coming in, and we screen from there. Or we look through current databases that we've already, candidates we've already pulled for other jobs to see if they're still looking for work. So that's definitely one approach, very viable approach. And again, sometimes because of resource limitations, that's all we can do. However, it can be really powerful to add a little bit of active sourcing in there. And what we mean by active sourcing is when you take a moment to reach out proactively to either groups that might have career sites or networking opportunities that can advertise your opportunity to a targeted audience, or to go reach out proactively to individuals. So maybe you go onto LinkedIn and you search sites of companies that are your competitors and look to see who's out there, who's doing work similar to the job that you're trying to fill. And you reach out to them and say, hey, if you're happy where you currently are, great. If not, I have an opportunity that may be of interest. The real benefit to active sourcing is that passive sourcing assumes that the person that you want is unhappy, and not just unhappy, but out there looking for work. Some of our best people are happily employed somewhere else. And so reaching out and tapping them on the shoulder and saying, what you've got now may be great. And if that's so, awesome. But if you're looking for a new challenge, a new opportunity, let's have coffee, let's talk. And that can be sometimes how you find the best people. So if you can, try to build in some active sourcing into your sourcing efforts. Another tip is just to constantly be sourcing. Hopefully, as business leaders, even in a COVID world, we're focusing some time and effort on networking, on building relationships with people outside of our normal operating circle. That's a great way to meet potential candidates and just to keep those relationships warm. You never know when a need might arise. And it's great to just have a network of people to reach back out to. The other thing I would suggest is as you hire, track which sources are working well for you in your organization. It's interesting. Sometimes we see real patterns there. I've got some clients where their number one recruiting source is employee referrals. And so we encourage them, and they did offer a wonderful employee referral bonus program to encourage employees to continue to refer their friends. And that does a couple of things. I mean, number one is it means a lot if you're going to refer a friend to an organization in terms of kind of their confidence in the organization. But it also builds a really interesting and fun culture when you've got a lot of people working together who kind of know each other and work together maybe before. It builds some interesting efficiencies and sociability into the culture that can be really nice. So do track where your great hires are coming from and throw extra effort in sourcing at those sources, if that makes sense. So you've posted your vacancy. you've sourced your candidates. Now you have a whole bunch of resumes and you're trying to figure out what to do with them. So that's where this next step comes in, which is what we refer to as screening. And the whole goal of screening is filtering, right? You're trying to narrow your applicant pool to a small number of candidates that you want to consider. So you're looking at resumes to make sure that they meet the qualifications that you've posted in the position. You're looking at cover letters. You know, those are, these days, cover letters really make a candidate stand out because, as I mentioned before, everything's so automated right now. And it's so easy to just click to apply, click to apply, click to apply. When you get a cover letter that has someone who clearly put thought into their communication to you, to explain why they want to work for your organization or why they think they'd be a great fit, it really is a differentiator. So, you know, I'd encourage you to ask for that. It's not so much to ask for a candidate to put a cover letter on top of a resume. So that can be a differentiator and help weed out candidates. You could ask for a cover letter and 50% still won't. And they'll hope they get through just on their resume alone. You can decide whether or not you want to consider them if they didn't follow that instruction. That's up to you. But really, it's a nice way to weed out who follows instructions. You can evaluate writing skills by a cover letter. If you've got someone who writes a beautiful cover letter, you can be like, wow, that person's got a good grasp of writing. That's a rare commodity these days, people who are really good writers. And so that could be something that catches your eye. I know a lot of people who, and I'm very torn on this myself, who have kind of a no typos rule in resumes and cover letters, where they'll automatically disqualify a candidate if they see an errant colon or a miscapitalized word or something that's been misspelled, because they'll view it as a failure to pay attention to detail. And that's very legitimate. I mean, you've got to decide if you're truly going to eliminate all candidates. You know, I just say pick a standard and apply it to everybody, and apply it consistently. You know, if you're going to let a punctuation error to slide, if you've got an outstanding candidate, you know, great. If you do choose again to have even the tiniest of typos, eliminate someone from consideration, that's fine. That's your prerogative. Just know you may wind up missing some talented candidates as a result. And again, just apply whatever your standards are consistently to all of your applicants. And what you recommend, usually in a vacancy notice and a job posting, there's a section of, you know, candidates must have, right? And a bulleted list of those. You know, focus on those first, and then you can kind of look at the nice to haves. Just make sure that your must haves really are must haves, because you can start running into problems when you said it was a must have, but then you hired somebody who didn't have it, in terms of kind of fairness and equity issues. So make sure your must haves really are must haves. Everything else can fall into a great to have category. Now, tools to source and screen. So this is where we can talk a little bit about social media. Using social media to source candidates is a no-brainer, right? Going out and using LinkedIn or job networks or anything else you can think of to find your candidates. I mean, why wouldn't you? It's some wonderful information that's out there. Using social media to screen candidates has to be approached a little bit more carefully in order to avoid issues. And there's a whole section of HR law that's focused on this. And has been for years now. So I'll try to kind of pull out some highlights. At the end of the day, if you're using social media to screen your candidates, there are definitely some recommendations we've received from employment attorneys. It's always recommended that you have your process reviewed by an employment attorney to make sure that they're comfortable with how you're using social media. Basically, in a nutshell, if you're going to use social media, there's some tips that you'll want to use. And again, this is for screening purposes. The first is to really only look at social media after final offers are made and view them as part of the standard background check process. So maybe you do background checks where you do criminal background investigations, maybe you check college transcripts, maybe you do professional references. Social media becomes one more step in that background check process. And that can prevent claims that you made hiring decisions based on information that you saw in someone's social media activity, which is a big area of legal concern. So again, hold till after final offers are made. So you can say contingent upon passing our background check process, which includes ... Another recommendation is to only have human resources do your social media checks. There's a couple reasons for that. One is because HR theoretically is trained to handle confidential information and knows what can and can't be done with the information that they see on social media. The other reason, and this is probably the more compelling one, is that we don't want hiring managers who really have the ultimate decision-making authority to accidentally trip on something that may influence them either in their hiring decision or in how they treat the candidate if they're hired down the road. So it's better to insulate the hiring manager from that. And if the HR person conducts the social media search and finds something that's worrisome, then we work with our employment attorney to figure out the best way to handle that situation without kind of sending the link to the hiring manager and sharing all the gory details, right? So confidentiality and discretion is really important. We also don't want to solely rely on social media for screening our people. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of which is that all sorts of stuff exists out there that's not verified. You can look at, with a name like Fern Hernberg, the odds that you're going to trip upon another Fern Hernberg who's got, lots of bad stuff out there on social media. No, that's probably me that you see out there. But if you've got someone with a more common name, we've had lots of situations where people made decisions or judgments about someone only to find out it was a different person with the same name. There's lots of landmines that can come with social media searches. So you really want to make sure that you're using that as one little data point if you use it at all. Now, lots of people will argue about whether you should use it at all. Most people I hear say it's crazy not to check it. Crazy not to check it because there's so much information that could be out there that would be important. But if you do, again, do it at the right step in the process. Make sure the right person is handling your social media checks. Make sure that if you are going to make any kind of decision based on information you see out in social media, that you're using an HR consultant or an employment attorney to guide you as to the appropriate way to handle that. Because there are laws, as a matter of fact, that protect candidates from misuse of information that can be found online. Make sure you don't misstep. Okay. I know this is a lot of information. I feel like I'm whipping through it really fast, but I do want to get to give you some questions at the end. So that's your screening. So ideally, you found a whole bunch of candidates. You've used a variety of screening processes to get to kind of a shortlisting opportunity. So now we're probably at the point where you can talk about phone screens. Okay, so you've funneled down your candidate pool. You've got a handful of folks who meet your minimum qualifications. They followed the instructions that you put in the job vacancy notice in terms of cover letter or providing salary requirements or whatever those things were. You did your consistent for everybody a social media check by HR, and these folks had no red flags or anything like that. Who do you phone screen, right? So this is where we would call the candidates themselves, have prepared questions in advance. You would call professional references, right? So it's okay at this point to say, hey, do you have a few people you've worked with? I'd like one from each of your past employers. Again, have questions ready and prepared. And then personal references really only if necessary. So most candidates ought, even if they've had kind of an unfortunate employment situation or two, and we've all had them where we don't necessarily want to give a reference from that employer, most people who've had a decent amount of career experience will be able to provide some sort of professional reference for you, even if it's a person relatively early in their career who had summer jobs while they were in college or things like that. Personal references have really limited applicability. And so, you know, if you're hiring for an internship or someone who's kind of fresh out of school, we could do that. Better than nothing. But even then, I would say try to get a teacher or a coach or someone who had a little bit more than just a, this is my mom's best friend relationship with them. Now, this is probably a good time to pause and say, we've gone through several steps already. It may feel like, wow, this process has been going on for a really long time. Hopefully not. Hopefully that's not the case. We know, it stands to reason that the longer the job recruiting process takes, the greater the chance that your applicants are going to wind up getting recruited somewhere else. They're going to go somewhere else. You'll lose them. So we want to prepare in advance as much as possible so that from the time that vacancy posting goes up and candidates first learn about the opportunity, we're able to move relatively quickly. So by the time you get to your shortlisting process, by the time you're making these phone screens, you should have already had your phone screen questions ready, your reference check questions ready, so that it's just, you know, I took some time yesterday, I weeded through the resumes, I'm going to go ahead and make some phone calls today. And so it's a process that moves, you know, with some alacrity, if that makes sense. So for shortlisting and for interviews themselves, a couple of things. You want to make sure the right people are conducting those for you. So if you don't have an HR department or you don't have resources to hire somebody and you're having the hiring manager call and do that, that's fine. A lot of us have to do that out of necessity. But just make sure that whoever it is that you're asking to take on these responsibilities, that they are prepared to do so, and they know what's appropriate and what's not. Too many times in organizations, we just say to people, hey, you go interview that person, right? You go call that reference. There's really important things for people to know and consider when they're doing interviews and reference checks to protect the organization from legal liability. So prep those people, pick them carefully. They are representing you in your organization, and then prep them carefully. So make sure they know that they can't ask things like, how old are you? Or when were you born? When did you graduate? Even something that seems innocuous like, oh, I went to University of Delaware too. What year did you graduate? That could come back at some point. If the person didn't get the job, they could say, well, everything was going great till I told them that I graduated in 1993 and they realized how old I was. And then all of a sudden you've got an age claim on your hands. So be really, even small talk can lead to questions that are not appropriate for the interview setting. We don't want to ask, obviously, about religious practice or affiliation, marital or parental status, any kind of, and with this one we see a lot, especially these days, children or child care arrangements, disabilities. Whenever you have a question for a candidate, you want to make sure that it's tied to the responsibilities of the role. So you can say, you know, are you able to be in the office from 8 to 6, Monday through Friday? Perfectly appropriate. What you can't say is, do you have little kids at home who are not going to be in school this fall and are going to need your attention? Not okay. What you care about is whether they can perform the functions of the job. And so that's what your questions need to stick to. Another one we see all the time. Do you have a car, or where do you live? We don't need to know if they have a car. I mean, unless they're in a delivery role or something like that, where they need their own car in order to make their deliveries. But it's more of the, where do you live? What's your commute like? Really can't ask that question, because the answers to those questions could introduce all sorts of information about demography, socioeconomic status, all sorts of stuff. So what we want to ask is, this role requires somebody to be here at 9 o'clock every day. Are you able to meet that commitment? We don't care. They can fly. If they can fly here and get here by 9 o'clock every day, great. Not our business how or where they live. So again, just kind of make sure, and there's lots of tools available. I'm happy to share some of my own if you're interested, but just to make sure that the people who are meeting with the candidates and speaking with the candidates know what they can and can't ask. Okay, so the last piece of the process that we're going to talk about this morning is interviews. So interviews, like the phone screens and the reference checks, are where if you do a little bit of organization and pre-planning, you are going to save yourself so much time and headache down the road. It's going to be insane. Okay, so please take my word for it. Couple of tools here that can be really helpful for you. One is an interview form, and you can put it in, you can take a sample from something online, you can create your own. It doesn't have to be pretty. Basically, what you're trying to do is make sure that you're listing the questions in advance that you want to ask, so that you're asking all your candidates the same questions. That's a really important piece. And that you have a way to record their responses so that you can remember one candidate from another. It's a really helpful tool as you go through the interview process and interview a lot of candidates. But outside of just the discussion, the interview discussion, think about in advance, how many candidates do you want to interview? Sometimes our roles require such specialized skills. We're lucky if we can find 1 or 2 people to interview for them, and we hope that one of them will work out. But most likely, in most cases, we get a lot of candidates for our roles, and we need to decide, do we want to narrow it down to 3 finalists that we'll invite in for interviews? Would we like to see 5? That's a good thing to know as you're going in. Doesn't mean you can't change your mind, but just to have an idea down the road, we'd like to see at least 3 people. So we're going to keep the posting up until we get 3 good candidates to see and compare. We want to know who will conduct the interviews and where. These days, the where doesn't come into play quite so much because almost everything is by, Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever, but have the format identified. Timing's important. Whether you use one-on-one interview format or a panel is important. Again, it's a little different now that we're mostly remote, but I have clients who like the panel approach, which is great. There's a fine line between walking into what feels like a panel and walking into what feels like a firing squad. So you do want to make sure that if you use a panel, you don't totally overwhelm a candidate by having them sit down at a table, and look at 6 faces across the table from them. It can be a little overwhelming. And remember that whatever you decide, it's sending a message to the candidate about what type of culture you have, right? So maybe you do a combination. Maybe you have some one-on-ones, and then if somebody gets past a certain point in the process, they meet with a panel of people who would be their colleagues. You can design it any way you want, but decide in advance, again, so you can be consistent with your candidates. Decide in advance if you're going to be using any kinds of tests or assessments. And a few words about the tests or assessments. I think they can be wonderful when you're trying to assess certain skills like writing ability or problem solving process, thought process. Just be careful with those, because I've had candidates say to me before, they put me through too much. Right? Like, I'm willing to go through 3 interviews. I'm willing to make a presentation, like a fake presentation, so they can see my presentation skills. I'm willing to do a case study so they can gather my thought process. But when they had me come in for the 4th time to give a 3rd presentation on a 3rd new topic, I really felt like they were just kind of making me jump through hoops at that point. And it didn't feel worth it to me at that point. So just be careful that you've defined your process in advance, that it's reasonable. Remember, you're asking somebody to do this on their own time. They're probably taking time off of another job to come interview with you and do these things. So we want to be respectful of their time and their energy and effort, while at the same time trying to gather the information we need to make a decision. Um, and you also want to know your decision-making process and define that in advance. So I know that I want to look at 3 really, really solid candidates for comparison. They're going to come in, they're going to meet with me first, then they're going to meet with my boss for the second interview process. And if they pass both, we'll invite them to have, a virtual coffee with the rest of the team. And if all that goes well, we're going to go ahead, administer a writing exam, and then, unless they blow that, we will make a decision as a panel and send, the HR will send the offer letter. But whatever it is, you've had the roles thought out, you've had the process thought out in advance, and roles defined in advance. Don't forget to let the candidates know what to expect. So this goes back to what we said before about kind of keeping them in the loop. You don't want to lose a candidate because you're working really hard in the background to make everything right for their interview process, but you've gone radio silent for them. And so they just hear crickets, and they don't know that they're your top candidate. They don't know what's still left in the process. They don't know what to expect. So schedule as promptly as you can. Give them enough time to plan. Let them know as much as you can what your process looks like. And I do like having people at least have 2 distinct, we'll call it visits, whether it's an actual visit to an office or a different day where they're doing remote meetings, only because I think, most people can kind of get their way through an hour or 2 of an interview on one day, but it's nice to see people on a subsequent day just to make sure that they're consistent in their answers and in their presentation and things like that. But let them know what's involved, let them know how final decisions will be made and how they're going to receive any notice of next steps. So, thanks so much for coming in today. I'm going to go back and, we're going to review all the candidates that we've seen so far, and we'll either invite you to come back next week for a second interview, or we'll let you know that we've decided to move in a different direction. But either way, you're going to hear from us by the end of the week. Wonderful, right? And then just follow through on that. But we don't want candidates kind of hanging out there, not knowing what's going on. And then I mentioned there were 2 tools for interviews. So the first was, kind of just where you capture your interview questions. And this really makes the best thing to do here is hold it against the vacancy notice, hold it against the position description, and make sure the things that you said you needed for the role are things you're really asking about in the interview itself. That way there'll be no gaps. You'll make sure, you won't go through the interview process only to realize that nobody thought to ask the candidate about, how proficient they were with PowerPoint or whatever the case may be. But it will help you capture the most important aspects of the role and their qualifications and experience to do the role. It also aids in the comparison of candidates in the selection phase, right? So if for anybody who's interviewed a lot before, once you see 3, 4, or maybe it's just me, but once you see 3, 4, 5, 10 candidates for a role, no matter how wonderful people are and how engaged you are in the conversation, things start to blur together. You start forgetting who said what and who did what, and was it that person who had that experience? And so this really helps you capture it all so that you can compare, again, against the same standards for each candidate. And then you can use an interview evaluation form to really compare the candidates side by side. And I highly recommend this, when somebody says, comes back later and says, I believe I was not hired because of my age or because of that thing on social media. You can pull out a tool that says, no, look, this is our interview evaluation form. This is where we evaluated each candidate based on the things we said were important to the role. And this is where we see that candidate A rose to the top. And as much as we liked you, you did not. And so this is a support for the decisions that you choose to make after the interview process. So really important tool. You can Google examples. You can call it an interview evaluation form or a candidate evaluation form. I also have samples I'm happy to share with folks if that's helpful. But again, once you put something like this together, you can use it for future, your future openings. You don't have to do this every single time. So it's not, a hugely onerous process once you do it once. And then I did just want to take a moment to talk about behavioral interviewing. So, we've talked about a lot of tactical stuff, right? Tools to use and how to schedule and pick the interviewers and all that. But how you actually speak to your candidates can make a huge difference in the kind of information you get back from them. And that information is going to be what you're basing your decisions on. So what we recommend is, what's called behavioral interviewing. And what you're basically doing in a behavioral interviewing process is trying to get people to provide really rich, meaningful answers to your questions, as opposed to short, closed, 1 or 2 word responses. And the way we do that is we ask people to describe situations, tasks, actions they took, and the results of the situation. And I'll show you kind of how that looks in action. So here are some examples, right? These are, rather than saying, what's your greatest strength? What's your greatest weakness, right? All those, are you a good people person? Those types of things, those types of questions, which lend themselves to very short, uninteresting, and uninformative answers. We ask people to describe a situation or give an example or explain to us how they've done something. So again, go use your job description as a guide. If you want to know how resilient somebody is, and that's important to your job, then ask them a question like, tell me about a time you were working on something and things went horribly off track. What happened? What did you do about it? And what was the outcome? Think about how rich a response you can get from that. So first of all, it's gonna give you a sense of what that person how they define resilience and what they view as that kind of good problem solving behavior. So again, you're asking them to describe the situation. What happened? Tell me about what happened when something went horribly off the rails. What was your role? And what actions did you take to get things right again? How did that work out? Let them tell stories to you, and it's going to be a much more rich and meaningful information gathering for you than if you just ask them really closed-ended questions. So again, I keep saying I have tons of resources and materials I'm happy to share, or come up with your own questions. The most important thing is that when you ask the questions, they're measuring what's important to you and what's meaningful for the role. So, if timeliness isn't something that really matters in the work that they're going to be doing, don't waste valuable interviewing time asking about timeliness. Ask about innovation. When was a time you demonstrated your innovation? What did you develop and how did you share it with the world and all that? Kind of making them up off the top of my head. But it's a really nice interviewing practice to develop. And last but not least, I do want to make sure we talk a little bit about kind of your personal role in the process. To the extent that you are evaluating candidates, just be aware of some of the different biases that we kind of bring to the table. Again, the use of the tools that we talked about before, the candidate evaluation form, the interview question form, this will help you evaluate candidates more objectively rather than letting some of your own preferences kind of creep in. Just step back and make sure you're checking yourself on these. And then, make sure roles are really, really clearly defined so things don't get dropped and lost and everybody's got clarity. Now, you may find yourself in a situation where you're like, Fern, I don't have HR. Like, I'm a small operation. It is me and it is my controller and it is my business development person. And if that's the case, you're going to own a lot more of these processes, or they are. But either way, make sure those roles are clearly defined, that you know what's expected of you, they know what's expected of you, and that everybody is prepared to execute those roles and responsibilities. And it's not just about knowing what's legally permissible, but knowing what questions to ask, how decisions are going to be made, all that good stuff. So That was a lot. I am going to give a quick preview for the next presentation, which, as Brian mentioned already, is on selection and onboarding. So that's where we kind of go from the interviewing process and take it, the next 2 steps in to the life cycle. And that's currently scheduled for August 11th. So we'll hope you join us then. And then we will have another session down the road, the graceful exit, how to kind of part as friends and retain relationships with people when they're no longer working for your organization. And we'll get more information about that shortly out to you. But with that, I will pause. I will take a sip of my coffee and see if there are any questions I can answer for you.
Thank you, Fern. That was excellent. I actually took a bunch of a post person, so I was writing a bunch of myself things to inquire about. We do have a question, but I think it might have been answered in that one of those previous slides where you talked about roles and responsibilities, and the question was really focused on first it was when do you do a reference check, and I think also related was who. So HR should be doing it, but who at what point in time? I think you could just revisit that for a quick second, because I think you had a good answer on that, but the specific question is when do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's actually some legal considerations here. So I think it's best to clarify, draw a distinction between a reference check and a background check. So a reference check is really just reaching out to people who know the person, right, to get their thoughts on that individual. And I like doing that somewhat early in the process. I kind of like doing that after let me get my steps of the process in place. So you phone screen, you bring in people to interview. At that point, I like doing, after you've brought people into interview and you're like, wow, I really like this candidate, I'm kind of considering an offer for them. That's where I like to do the, the reference check. And that's a great, you can go to the candidate, you can say, the next step in our process is to check your references. Would you be willing to share people I can speak to from each of your past jobs? And you do that, right? And that can help drive a decision to make an offer or not. What you can't do until you've extended a formal offer is a background check. So the background check are things like the criminal background check, the educational verifications, again, social media, we would put in that category as well. Those you don't want to do until you've already extended a formal offer. And that's protection for you to show that you're not basing your decision to make an offer on anything that you may find in those background checks or social media checks. So what you do is you send an offer letter that says, we're offering you this position. Here are the terms and conditions. Your offer is contingent upon your successful completion of our background check process. And that includes criminal, educational, social, whatever your process includes. But the references, sorry, my dog only has about an hour of good behavior on him. The reference checks can come before that in the process.
Gotcha. So
does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. So one thing that I found, maybe this goes back to my own personal experience, because my involved working and making my own living is involved in retail, and so the kind of the retail aspect and the dealing with a customer on a per moment basis really kind of shaped the way that I view engaging with a client today. And it really comes down to me, it's customer experience. And so you were talking about when you make a posting that what you're doing is you're really marketing your business. And to me, it comes back to, back when I was in my early 20s and I was managing a retail store and somebody would ask for help. And you have a lot of different ways that you can help them. They may say, hey, where is X? And you just say, oh, it's on aisle 9. I know in my experience as a consumer that when somebody says there's two different, there's either, hey, it's on aisle 9, or hey, it's on aisle 9 on the right-hand side, or they're like, hey, come on, I'll take you there. And what else do you need? And it's a matter of kind of creating an experience for that person. And
yes,
that then
beautiful.
Permeates into culture. And it comes into this is how we do things here. Regardless of whatever anybody else does, I'm going to take you not by the hand per se, but I'm going to walk you to what you're asking for and see if I can help expand that for you. And I think those principles that I learned, managing different retail stores in my early 20s apply to helping a client solve a problem when they're like, hey, I have this problem. And it's, you could point them and say it's right over there, or you could kind of shepherd them and try to help facilitate. I think that's kind of what you were driving at earlier. At least that's what it evoked in me immediately. I thought of like the way that I approached working as a retail manager.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it was beautifully put. I think, one of the things that I try to talk with my clients about is viewing the relationship with their employees really from the very beginning to forever, right? So a lot of times we view it as it's from orientation or their first day of work until the day they leave. But I think that's starting too late and ending too early. I think the moment you touch them as a candidate, the relationship begins, and you really can stay connected to them forever as a valued alumnus of your company and a potential future referrer of candidates, referrer of work, just partner, network, colleague. They're wonderful relationships to have. And so it takes a little extra time and effort, but it can be so worth it to just kind of shift your view of that relationship.
I had another question that popped up, right? So you were talking at some length about like internal referrals, and you've had some companies and clients that have had a lot of success with that. And I was curious, just kind of putting you on the spot as a question, because I've seen those. Most companies have, hey, we'll give you $2,500 or $35, some number that they'll associate with it. And I think almost every company I've ever worked for has had something along those lines. But many times it doesn't necessarily mean anything, meaning that it's not a strong program. People aren't referring in. So the kind of the tough question that I have is, do you see or do you feel that the success of an internal referral program is almost like a litmus test to what the employees believe of the culture and the organization in and of itself?
I think it's exactly a litmus test of what the employees think about the organization. Think about what it would take for you to refer a friend, for you to put a friend into an environment that you didn't believe in, or you didn't feel comfortable in, or you thought might make them look at you and say, thanks a lot, bud, for putting me in this place, right? Like I left a job to come to this and you knew it and you brought me anyway.
Yeah.
I think it takes so much for someone. It says so much about their level of engagement if they're going to pull a friend or a colleague in to work with them, that if you're not seeing success in a referral program, the first thing you should be looking at is your culture. Why aren't people sending people our way? That's a huge red flag to me. And I think it's a good thing to have your arms around in your organization.
Gotcha. And I know I had one other thought that popped up is I was talking to a friend of mine who's a recruiter yesterday. He works kind of in the executive senior level search for like an accounting and finance firm, like a boutique firm. And like just thinking outside the box, he was like, yeah, I have relationships at universities. And a lot of recruiters have relationships at universities that have pipeline programs. But he specifically has relationships with a couple of professors that, they teach higher level classes. In my experience, many professors have some level of engagement outside of their academic field. They're doing things out in the marketplace as well. And so they have a network. And I made a comment to him. I said, well, that's why you are where you are in your career, is because you're thinking outside the box and you've developed kind of non-traditional methods of sourcing candidates, because he was going out and pitching to these professors like, hey, I need this type of a person. Who do you know that's really good in kind of these skill sets and these kind of has this kind of experience? Who have you seen? Who have you worked with? And so anyway, that was an interesting idea, and it literally just happened yesterday afternoon when I was chatting with him. So.
That's all about your active sourcing, right? So if you go back to that active sourcing discussion, it's the asking yourself the question, the people that I'm thinking of for this role, like where do they hang out? Where do they socially network? So I can go through those means. Where do they currently work? So I can try to tap into networks at those organizations. Where do they eat lunch? I mean, anything that can give you insight. Where are they in school? Where did they graduate from in the area? And making those connections. That's beautiful active sourcing. Absolutely.
I was at an event, maybe this was pre-pandemic, probably even it was probably 2019. And there was a recruiter that was talking on a panel discussion, and she recruits in the GovCon space, really in the high level, like the TSSCI, right? And these men and women are generally ghosts socially, right? Because
Mhm.
right? They don't have these profiles because they can't, right? It's not in their best interest. And so the tactic that she used is she figured out, okay, where is this contract, like physically, and then what is the nearest like mid to upper end level social place,
Yep.
go, bar basically. And she she went to that place to bump into people and hand out her card. um,
Yep.
she was able to then get people that she never would have been able to see, because they go into a place that you can't talk to them, and they're not on LinkedIn, um, and they don't get onto these job boards until they want to, and when they don't want to be on them, they're off again. So she had great success, and this was, again, trying to figure out what's a different way to approach the problem of
Yeah.
forcing people for really, really tough positions.
Great. Such a great idea. Yeah. Got
Well,
to be resourceful,
yep.
especially in a tight market.
With that, anyway, so for those of you that stuck around for the extra 5 minutes or so, I appreciate it. Uh, as you exit, there should be a survey. We would greatly appreciate you completing that. It takes, on average, about 59 seconds. So not asking you to do too much more, although I have taken 5 more minutes of your day than I promised I would. Um, I've got a webinar next week on financing for government contractors. So if you want to learn more about that, you'll be able to register for that as well. So I want to thank you all for your attendance and engagement. And Fern, thank you for your energy, enthusiasm, and expertise. It was really great. I'm looking forward to part 2 and part 3 once we get that scheduled as well.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Take care, everyone.